Hi everyone, I'm Mike. This is the Sunday Art Show, and this week we're going to be doing a plein air beach painting. So you can see I've started out by drawing these cliffs. I'll show you the view in a moment, and I've included some patchwork line work and a couple of houses on the cliff top. I haven't copied the scene exactly, just enough to get a flavour of the scene. Included a few little boats pulled up on shore and another one off in the distance there. And then that's going to help create a sense of depth. The distant shoreline, a couple of, lines to indicate the sea. We've got a wave, small wave breaking in the foreground. And then some indication of the pebbles. I'm not quite sure how I'm going to tackle that at this stage. But this little drawing was created with watercolour marker on mixed media paper. So we're down at Budleigh Salterton on the south coast of Devon. Quite a unique setting, Pebble Beach, red sea, red cliffs. So I'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. Got a pebble weighing down my palette because it's quite breezy today. Alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue, cad yellow. I've got my water pot weighed down with some more pebbles. Got my interactive acrylics. I'm actually using a pearlescent tinting white rather than titanium white. Got my little camera there, Winsor and Newton field easel, and my water spray bottle. So if you've been watching the channel for a little while, you may remember I've painted Budleigh Salterton a couple of times before, and for the most part they've been very quick watercolour studies when I've been actually down on the beach working outdoors. So I thought it would be fun this time to have a go with the acrylics, and I'm starting out with a synthetic flat brush round about 1/2 inch wide, and I'm just scumbling in the sky, keeping the treatment very simple. So it's mostly white, a good bit of the blue but not too much, and then just a touch of the alizarin crimson, and I think I may have added a little bit of burnt umber to my palette and popped a bit of that into the sky as well. Now I've used a turquoise watercolour marker to put the drawing down, and you notice the breeze is catching my paper. It is really quite a blustery day down on the coast here. So having the drawing there is a nice safety net, it's a nice guideline to not to stick to, too carefully, but it's good to have it. Now the cliffs, as we go off to the left, they get more and more distant, and they become a little more grey, a little more purple, a little more muted in colour. So that's why I'm adding this rather subdued purple. And again, I'm just keeping the treatment very simple. I'm essentially just blocking in the region with colour here. But having said the word colour, what I really mean is, I'm more concerned with tone than getting the colour exactly right. Now I could just sweep in a huge block of colour across the entire cliff face, but having taken the trouble to sort of mark out those little patches, so I don't know if you noticed before, but on the red cliffs you've got the red rock, but then the bushes and the grasses and the plants which grow on top of the cliff, they kind of tumble down and grow on the cliff face as well. So those little patches I've indicated with my drawing, I'll colour them in something approaching green a little bit later. Now when I work across the watercolour marker with the brush, even if the brush is loaded with the acrylic, sometimes you can get the watercolour to bleed a little bit, and that can be actually quite helpful. It can be quite an efficient way of getting a nice effect. You can see there's a little bit of a bleed of the turquoise blue going on at the base of the cliff there. And I'll use that technique later as well, probably. Don't think I mentioned the paper I'm using, but as I often do, I'm just using the mixed media Daler-Rowney paper. And I've changed the colour of the cliffs to make them slightly more red the further right I've gone. So at the far left, if you look, right on the edge of the far left of the paper, the cliff looks almost blue. And as we come right a little bit, it's kind of purplish, and then it sort of gradually comes into a deep red on the right. Now on top of the cliff, if you look at my easel clamp, you can just about see the top of the cliff to the right of the easel clamp, just above the pebble beach. On top of the cliff, it's a ton of trees and bushes and stuff, which the houses kind of peek out of. So I've mixed up a bluey green, again keeping things fairly neutral and subdued, and again I'm scumbling that across that entire area. And if the brush kind of runs out, if the brush kind of runs out of paint as I'm working, when I go back to my palette, what I'll often do is say I've got a little bit of the green left mixed up on the palette. And what I'll do is I will just catch the tiniest corner of my brush in the alizarin crimson and mix that into the green. And then maybe the next time I go back, I'll flick a little bit of the yellow in, or a little bit of the white. So what I'm doing then by doing that is, as I scumble around that entire cliff top, I'm automatically creating a slight variation in the greens that I'm putting down. It's only subtle, but that variation in colour, combined with the variation in the thickness of the paint that I put down, which is sort of naturally occurs as you scumble the brush around, depending on how loaded your brush is, it creates a nice bit of subtle variation in the colour and the tone. And so that mimics reasonably well, the subtle variations you get in nature. And you can see I'm continuing this green colour down onto the face of the cliffs as well, in those little patches that I've left unpainted. Now, the houses I've put there on the cliff top, as I said, that in reality there are many houses on the cliff there on the hill. I've just put 2 in just to get a flavour of the scene, and the green I sort of cut around the houses. If I went over the drawing a little bit, I don't mind too much. But as I work to the left on the cliff face, I've been gradually making my green colour more subdued as the cliff goes off into the distance as well. So if you look at the green on the right, it's much more vibrant to the green on the far left. Coming in with a little bit more of an orangey colour now. I say orangey, it's an orangey green. Just to sort of add a little bit of warmth to the coolness of the background. So in many ways this scene is quite challenging. One of the traditional ways to create a sense of depth in landscape is to have something like a boat, which we know automatically the size of relative to a human, in the foreground, and then you've got those distant boats like I've got there, which are much smaller. But here I've got a completely empty foreground, and that's a little bit of a challenge to create some depth. So we'll come on to that a little bit later. What I'm doing here is just with a damp brush, just kind of moving the watercolour drawing around a little bit to make those houses a blue in watercolour effectively. And while that's still on the brush, I can sweep some of that same turquoise pigment to pop in some of the distant shoreline. So by making the houses blue, I can always add some highlights later, but it pushes them off into the distance because blue is such a cool colour. But I've replenished my brush with paint, adding in a little bit of a purple to the sea. So the sea at Budleigh can vary in colour, really quite dramatically over the course of minutes. Sometimes when the sun catches it, it can look almost bottle green or sky blue. And then other times, the currents stir up something from the seabed, and then you get this wonderful rust red colour. And other times, you get just sort of rust red in one patch and then a patch of green elsewhere. So it's really beautiful water, and I haven't seen anything quite like it on the English coast, at least. I mean, there are beaches nearby which are similar, but I think Budleigh probably has the most dramatic variations that I've seen. So the thickness of paint I'm applying kind of depends on what I'm painting. So, for example, I've kept things reasonably, a medium thickness I would say, definitely not impasto, for the cliff and the water. But now here for the distant beach, you can see I've just put a very, very thin layer on, and I'm just adding another thin layer now of the kind of reddish brown off in the distance. And you can see I'm sweeping the brush strokes. I scumbled on the cliff face because that's kind of rugged. I scumbled on the trees because they're kind of random. But for the beach, I want to indicate that it's sloping down towards the water. So I kept my brush strokes going from the top of the beach down to the shoreline. But in with this beautiful deep red now. So the alizarin crimson is great for mixing up a variety of reds. It's much better than, for example, cadmium red. I mean, I love cadmium red as a colour, but the alizarin crimson gives you a little bit more flexibility for mixing up reds and purples. And I'm varying that colour again as I work my way across the sea and allowing the colours to overlap and blend. I'm keeping the paint fairly thin here as well, my hope being that I get some kind of naturally occurring water-like effects as I let the colours merge into each other. Now for this small breaking wave I've put into the foreground, the face of the wave is somewhat darker, and it's certainly closer to us because the concave, so the darkness is because of the concave surface of the wave underneath the crest. And it's a bolder colour just because it's nearer to us. And for the moment I'm leaving the little bit of white water on top of the wave simply as the unpainted paper. So I'm trying to be a little bit careful here because the line work I put in for this wave breaking in was reasonably precise, and so there's a slight danger of just colouring in the line work. So that's why when I just did that last couple of brush strokes at the bottom of the wave, I let the paint be more fluid there. And you can see it's kind of lightened up the bottom of the wave directly under that little bit of white water. So my hope was to just introduce a little bit of randomness at that stage. But now we need to deal with the beach, and obviously there are, millions of pebbles here, and there's no way you can paint them all. So I'm starting out by just ignoring the fact that there are pebbles there, and doing a combination of a scumble that I'm doing now, combined with this kind of sweeping brush stroke that I did a moment ago, and I'm doing again now, of this kind of purpley blue. And you can see, if you kind of squint at the beach, then all of the pinks and the sort of rust reds and the pale yellows and the pale greys and the bluey greys, they kind of all merge into one. And the colour I've put down there, it's not 100% accurate, but it's not a million miles away either. So as an initial coat of paint, it's not a bad colour to start off with. And you can see at this stage, I'm just going right over the watercolour drawing that I've done. Now, one of the ways I'm hoping that what I'm doing here is going to create some sense of depth is that I've got this diagonal line as the sort of edge of the pebbles leading from bottom left towards kind of middle right. And I'm hoping that's going to kind of form a lead in for the eye off into the distance, along with the sweep round to the left of the beach. Here you can really see the watercolour marker running as the paint runs out of my brush, but my brush is still damp. And so the two are really compatible actually, the watercolour marker and the acrylic. They work really well together. And the pearlescent white, the tinting white that I'm using, so I decided to use that instead of the titanium white that I use more often. And it's kind of nice actually. It's when the paint dries fully, there's ever such a slight shimmer to the finish of the paint, and it kind of seems to feel appropriate for the type of day I'm trying to depict here, with all the light scattering off the pebbles and sparkling off the water and so on. So I'm just very lightly caressing the tips of the brush across the surface of the paper there with a kind of reddish brown, just to sort of blend in another colour and add a little bit of variation. Just taking a step back from the work to see what's going on. So here you can see the red and the deep bluey green, and how there's almost a hard boundary between the two. It's really quite unique. As I said, I don't know of any other place, certainly not in this region, where things look like that. Okay, so I've moved time on a little bit now. You can see some of the sparkle on the paint now it's dried. I've added some bold dark brush strokes in the extreme foreground. But what I'm doing here is I just want to soften and make that left-hand side of the cliff even more distant. So I'm just putting on a very thin glaze. It's just watered down acrylic of a muted kind of bluey grey. So what I've done here is I've mixed up some white, some burnt umber, some blue, to give myself a bluey grey, and then I've really diluted it down with water. And you can see when that's dried back, it kind of softens that cliff, so the cliff is kind of now disappearing off into the mist a little bit. Here I'm coming in with a small round brush to add a little bit of a darker purpley red shadow underneath the white water. And then here, you know, kind of another danger point really. I'm starting to draw on the wave. I'm starting to draw little concave lines to add a little bit of variety. You know, when a wave sort of cascades over, those lines often are there. You know, there are variations in tone and colour. And now that they've dried back, you can see they're not too extreme. So I think I got away with that. You know, I want this to be very much a painting, not necessarily pure impressionism, but you know, edging towards pure impressionism, I would say. I'm adding some sort of light wispy lines now, because again you get these little bits of white water on the face of the wave as well. But once again, I've just got to be careful not to overdo it and not get too fiddly. So one of the dangers with using the small brush is that obviously it's great for detail, but it pulls you towards drawing a line, you know, because that's what that brush is best for really, or making little tiny marks. Now if you've got the big brush, you're forced to be more expressive and bolder, but of course that's got a bit of a disadvantage because you can't always get the little detail that you want. So what I'm doing here now with the small brush is just trying to soften up some of my drawing that I've done and some of the marks I've made. So I'm hoping it's going to be a reasonable balance between the two. And now adding a few little touches of pure white here and there, just to indicate a little bit of the white water splashing around at the shoreline. Now if you look at the little bit of beach directly below the middle of the red of the cliff, you can really see the pearlescent white just kind of shimmering there a little bit. So I've speeded things up a little bit now. And I had a moment here, kind of in line with my initial drawing. I thought, well, what I'll do is I will paint in a few of these pebbles. Different colours, different shapes, different orientations. Obviously I'm not copying what's there on the beach exactly, just being inspired by it. And the idea was to have close up the pebbles fully rendered, and then as we move off into the distance, you know, obviously the marks become smaller and smaller. So that's what I'm doing here. And then just adding a little bit of texture over on the left, and kind of, you know, momentarily working in the distance as well, when the colour on my brush kind of suits my purposes. So we'll come back to the foreground in a moment, but right now what I'm doing is just filling in the silhouettes of those small boats that are off there in the distance. So the treatment of the boats needs, you know, can just be very, very simple. But the shape of the boat and the proportions of the boat needs to be pretty good. And off in the distance, with the way the lighting is today, most of these boats look pretty dark. But we've got to be careful not to make them too dark and too bold, because we still want them to be distant. So that's why I've gone with a fairly sort of deep purpley blue for the most part, or at least for that one on the right. And then I am varying the colour actually. I now remember I did vary the colour from one boat to the other just to break things up a bit. But the point still remains that, you know, when you put a little area of shadow in off in the distance, it's probably going to have more blue in it and be a paler shadow than if it was in the foreground. So now that those boats have dried back, you know, you can see it's just, you know, the treatment couldn't really be any simpler, but it's just enough to indicate that there's something there, and the shape is so recognisable, especially within the context of being on a sloping beach, that I feel it's enough to kind of create a sense of distance, or help to create a sense of distance. So I'm just kind of filling in some of the little patches of the very distant beach at the base of the cliff now, where I feel it's a little too bright and white. And really here, I'm not copying so much what's there. I'm again being inspired by it, and just simply adding a band of colour and rubbing my finger across the paint where needed. And if it's rather ill-defined, that distant shoreline, that is also going to help create a sense of distance. So when we work in the distance with landscape, we've got quite a lot of leeway and freedom to just let the paint do its own thing, or or soften certain areas. Now for the houses, again, I just need a little bit of detail there, just a couple of little dark marks to indicate the presence of a window or a door or something like that. And again, I'm being inspired by the houses that are on the cliff top in Budleigh to get the approximate proportions correct, so the windows are roughly the same size relative to the size of the house, and the doorways are roughly the same size. But I'm not too worried. The houses just help lend a sense of scale to the cliff. That's the main reason I've included them, really. Now I can just lighten up some of the sloping roofs to show that the sunlight is catching the tops of the houses there. And then there are certain areas on the cliff face as well where the light's catching, and it's a little more orangey, or we just need to brighten it up a little bit. But again, I've got to be careful not to overdo it and keep things pretty loose. And in fact, here what I'm doing on reflection, I thought I was about to do something else, so sorry about that. But what I'm actually doing is softening up some of those patches of green and making them a little bit looser. And now I'm adding some highlights, just a few, to the cliff face. Some darks to the foliage. And just a little more detail, a little more contrast, but again, keeping things pretty darn loose, so that the eye isn't fooled into thinking that this cliff is right in front of us. We have to keep things looking distant. Now for the beach, what I decided to do is dramatically soften that pebble work I did in the foreground with some overlaying dry brush marks. So there's a hint of pebble showing through, but the dry brush kind of hides them a bit, so it's a little bit more open to interpretation. A few highlights on the distant boats. And one of the challenges on a day like this, when it is so blustery, is the lighting conditions. As the clouds billow past the sun, they change really dramatically. So you've got to kind of just go for it and try and capture something of the day. What I was just doing there on that wave in the foreground was just kind of softening it a little bit, and just taking adding a little sense of movement. So I just wanted to show you this little clip again, because I think the water's so incredible, and it's like this, this bright red. And then boom, you can see there's a real sharp boundary to the bluey green. This is obviously looking in the other direction. So you can see I softened those pebbles in the foreground and added a sense of movement to that wave. And then it's always good to look at what you've painted and then compare it again with what's there. So, looking a little different to when I started because of the changing lighting conditions. But I feel I've captured something of the scene there. So definitely for me, the big learn on this one was the pearlescent tinting white. That was really useful, little discovery. So there's the finished painting. Hope you enjoyed spending this little day at the beach with me. Thanks very much for watching. Please remember to like, comment and subscribe. And I hope to see you next Sunday for the next episode of the Sunday Art Show.